first. I'm going to go to the live stream. Go live, wait for the actual direction. It should show up here. And it is saying we are live now, so that's not the right one.
Hey, little buddy, want a ride? Yeah, whatever. I'll be right back. Where can you catch our 150 Pokemon? On your Game Boy, that's where. Pokemon for Game Boy is here. With both packs, you can catch them all. Games and systems links.
Okay, so that's a little morbid. Anyway, afternoon, guys. We're doing a special stream today because, as you can see, I got some guests.
Hello.
Let me introduce some friends of mine. This here is Autumn. She's an old college friend of mine. And this is my chum Manny as well. They were in town and they're big Pokemon fans, so excited. We're going to play Pokemon. Specifically, we're going to be looking at the first generation of Pokemon, Pokemon Red and Blue specifically. These games were released in 1997?
They were released in the States, I believe 96 is when they started to come out.
Well,
but peak Pokemania started 97 to 99.
And yeah, like, just talking about the Pokemon Mania, I often talk with my coworkers about how freaking huge Pokemon was back in the day.
You can't underestimate how big it was.
I'm looking at these commercials right now, and I had a lot of these toys.
Yeah, like, it was just the biggest thing in the world at that time. Like, you could walk into Walmart, Toys R Us, like, any store.
Exactly. I had those. I have a very good memory of having the Pokemon, this exact thing, at my grandma's house on vacation when I went, out of town to go visit.
I rest my case.
Yeah,
It was
dude,
just...
that's a very happy memory. You have no idea how happy that memory is.
I remember begging my mom. She used to work at Toys R Us back in the day. I remember begging my mom getting like these toys of like Venusaur, Charizard, and Blastoise that they sold back in the day. And I specifically remember like the Blastoise toy was like a little water squirt gun thing. You press the back of its shell and it shoots water out of its cannons. And the Venusaur was like this little retractable thing for its Vine Whip.
I think I remember those. So as you can see, we got a lot of memories with Pokemon. Anyone our age is going to have memories with Pokemon.
Yeah, we're kind of the peak demographic. Go ahead, sorry.
Which is funny to think because, like, when these games were being made, there was actually a little bit of resistance at Nintendo whether or not they should be made. The whole concept of it was, like, the guy who came up with the idea, he was big on collecting insects as a kid, and he wanted to create a game based around that feeling, but also one that would take advantage of the Game Boy's link cable, which is why they released two versions of the game. The whole collect them all aspect of it, you had the two different versions, and they're both the same, but one version has Pokemon that the other doesn't, so if you wanted to fill out the Pokedex, you had to trade, and because of that, it just became big in Japan, and then it came to America. You had the anime, you had the games, you had tons of merchandise. It was just a phenomenon. We were all there. It was all completely insane.
I was born in 1995, and if you look at any Pokemon game that comes out, the earliest copyright date is 1995. The game was in production for 6 years, and it was a torturous development cycle, and it's a miracle that the game came out at all. It's a miracle that it's even as functional as it is. It's notoriously buggy. It's hopes and dreams. And Did You Know Gaming did a great translation of some magazine in Japan that was basically that Porygon was a joke written for us, the people that were growing up, because they were being asked, why are you making a Game Boy game? Why aren't you making a 3D polygon game? And they thought, wouldn't it be so funny if we put in our Game Boy game? Because what most people don't realize is that the life cycle of the Game Boy was expanded significantly by the release of Pokemon. The system got a new lease on life because obviously, you could put your Game Boy games in your Game Boy Color if you had that. But also, you know, if you just had an old Game Boy, Red and Blue were for Game Boy.
Yeah.
Yeah, and of course, the original Game Boy games were backwards compatible with the Game Boy Color. So
even the Game Boy Advance too.
Exactly, and honestly, if you were to ask me right now, I can't really think of an actual Game Boy game that's that would be considered iconic outside of Pokemon. I feel
outside
like
of Tetris.
Yeah, and
the one that got blown up in the Gulf War is in a museum, and that's like the only second most iconic Game Boy game.
That's another story though.
Yeah,
that's a different time.
But yeah, I can't honestly think of regular Game Boy games that would be considered iconic or that I would love to go back and play. It wasn't until the Game Boy Color where things really started to get going, with releases of course, Pokemon, Gold and Silver, DX versions of Link to the Past and Metroid, as well as Zelda. So, yeah, I mean, it really did give...
Pokemon really carried the Game Boy brand all the way through to the Game Boy Advance generation, which we might talk a little bit about. We have we have some questions just to be like, hey, here's some trivia about what Pokemon games we've played. My first Pokemon game was actually Emerald. I was 10 years old. It was my 10th birthday, so I find that very cute. So, I guess we should transition into some gameplay as well.
Yeah, we probably should get that going.
Yeah, we should get that going. So Jager can get that going, and I'll ask us all a question. What was everybody's first Pokemon game, and by extension, what was everybody's first starter? Because, like I said, I had Emerald as my first Pokemon game. That meant that my first starter ever is Chikorita.
Technically, I started with Pokemon Yellow, so in this case, it would be Pikachu. Although I did get a copy of Pokemon Red after the fact. I chose Bulbasaur in that case. And I remember preferring the Red version over Yellow. Something about it. I don't know what to tell you.
When it comes to playing Pokemon, specifically the Game Boy Advance versions, I got Pokemon Fire Red and Pokemon Leaf Green one Christmas, the same Christmas. It was excellent for me. And when I first played through a Kanto game, I picked Squirtle.
To be honest, it was so long ago. Like, I know my first Pokemon game was Gen 1. I think it was a blue version. We actually had both versions now that I think about it. And like I had to share with 3 brothers.
Yeah,
so
that's what I was gonna say. There's that.
I didn't get to pick my starter, but I probably picked either Charmander or Squirtle, because I don't think anyone picked Bulbasaur.
He just said he did.
I wasn't listening. I was listening to something else.
Yeah, I know.
Making sure this is gonna work.
We're working it out.
Yeah, that's the thing about these Pokemon games. You only have one save file, so this isn't like something that you could just share with your sibling.
Yeah, and a lot of the cartridges that are flowing around, unfortunately, the battery back is going bad on them too, so it's hard to even get a copy that saves these days unless you have to know how to fix that.
Thankfully, it's not too hard of a fix, but yeah, you can't.
Batteries
have to break.
But before we get on another tangent, like, this is Autumn's favorite game, he's gonna play for us. I'm gonna sit in the background here.
What I was just going to say is that if you're lucky enough to have a local retro game store, they will replace a battery for you for normally like a nominal fee, like a couple of dollars. That's actually what I did with my copy of Pokemon Crystal recently. I was playing through Crystal on a original cartridge on original Game Boy Color, and that was fun for me. I really like how they've reused the intro to this game in so many different mediums. They've used it in both the anime. Let's just be blue this time.
I think everyone who played this game probably named their character Ash because, let's face it, we were all really attached to the anime when it first started airing.
Oh, of course.
We wanted the video games to represent that. That's why they made Pokemon Yellow, just to make it more like the anime.
And also, Pokemon Yellow smoothed out a lot of the bugs that I already mentioned in Pokemon Red and Blue because, like we said, that game there's certain exploits that you have to play red and blue with if you want to pull them off. Yellow fixes some of those things. Oh, well, I guess I'll do the one thing that you can. If you check the PC, here's a potion. I think I read that in a guidebook.
Yeah, I had the Pokemon Yellow guidebook, and it was very helpful in getting through the game, believe it or not.
Something else that probably pissed off my brother when I was playing this back in the day was I would pick up the game and then I would start a new game not understanding what I was doing.
That's why you can't share that game with the siblings. That was the problem.
If anybody saw my face, just there was a meme going on Reddit of people drawing, what their first Pokemon game was, which is where I got a lot of these nice questions from, like what your starter was, what your first game was, what your first favorite Pokemon was. One of the things that they mentioned is your first shiny, and my first shiny was on a Game Boy Advance game, and it was a Magnemite, and it got lost to a neighbor deleting my Pokemon Emerald save. And this is by the time I was able to use the PAL part to transfer stuff through Pokemon Diamond. And I know Jager mentioned we wanted to talk about the difference between playing on original and versus emulation, and how Nintendo doesn't want to necessarily give us these games on Switch, but they did give them us on 3DS.
What I will always say to developers who complain about that, but then don't release their games, what's wrong with you? I have money. I want to give it to you.
Yeah, that's the biggest trap that I'm in, because it's a thing that people have talked about in many sectors, is that if there's no competition, there's something called enshittification. We're not gonna swear, but that's like an actual new term, and it basically means if there's no competition, the service that's provided gets worse and worse. And basically, Pokemon Company is the only people that are allowed to market and release official Pokemon projects. Fan projects are great, and I've been playing a really cool fan project recently, and Minecraft mods were always fun back in the day. Do we want to talk about this tutorial now?
I do want to talk about this because, I feel like Pokemon's influence on the RPG genre, particularly in America, is sort of underrated. Because I've always viewed Pokemon as sort of the perfect gateway RPG, and what's happening here is a perfect exemplification of that. Rather than just making a simple bare bones RPG like, say, Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, or less of a hindrance, Mario RPG, Pokemon instead presents a very simple and easy to understand system, and then just expands on that. So with 3 starters, you have a fire, a grass, and a water type, and they basically work like rock, paper, scissors. Water beats fire, fire beats grass, grass beats water. Anyone can understand that. And then as you keep playing the game, you learn about other types like bug, fighting, psychic, flying, all those different types, and they all have different strengths and weaknesses. Anyone can understand that, and that's why I feel like Pokemon is just the perfect beginner's RPG. Yes, Final Fantasy VII, it's the game that puts RPGs into the pop culture, but Pokemon is the one that I feel made sure it stayed there because it kept introducing young players to the concept of an RPG. Let's hear from Manny, because he's been very quiet.
Yeah, and I just had to check just to get my timeline straight. And believe it or not, technically, Pokemon wouldn't be the first monster-catching RPG, and I know there's a lot of monster-catching RPGs that came out.
I think Monster Rancher predates it.
Does it? I thought that was a PS1 game.
I think you're right. I might be wrong.
But I know Shin Megami Tensei predates Pokemon, and that could also be considered a monster-catching RPG. The best way I could describe it is Pokemon for crazy people. It's crazy tough. It's not something accessible for children.
It is not for me.
It's not accessible for children. It's a very brutal RPG. But
don't even get started on the Persona series. That stuff is nightmare fuel.
Yeah, but Pokemon really put the monster catching RPG into the mainstream.
It also came out very similar at the same time as Digimon, so it had a very strong competitor, which is why I brought up that term, is that Pokemon and Digimon were fighting it out for superiority here in the North American market. And, I didn't mean to click that again. Okay, cool.
And if you check the S&T timeline, believe it or not, like, they had their own spin-off of Mega 10 game that, with 2 versions similar to Pokemon Red and Blue, to compete with Pokemon themselves. They had games going all the way up until the Advance era.
And like even like one of the tragic things, like one of the negative things that effects that Pokemon and Digimon had was with the animes that were running at the time, both extremely popular and on competing networks. They were constantly having these great big humongous marathons, and because of that, other shows at the time that were very high quality ended up getting shuffled around the schedule, and because of that, they would end up with low ratings and would be canceled.
Alright, we got our first wild encounter. So one of the things that's nice about the tutorial is that if you win, you get a level up. And it shows that, oh, progress happens. And another thing that's really nice is that we're playing with the, is this the Super NES or just the NES border?
This is probably the border they had for the Super NES.
Yeah, the Super NES had the thing where you could put your Game Boy games in your Super NES.
They called it the Super Game Boy.
Mm-hmm, Super Game Boy. And I thought it was the coolest thing ever when I saw the GameCube equivalent and somebody playing Emerald. But what's nice is that when you use a battle with this border, you actually get color and you get this indicator on the screen. I know, you can see the screen. But it's yellow. It's saying that this health is at middle. It's a good visual indication, and it's, like Jacob was saying, it's a great introduction to RPGs. But it's also a great introduction to RPGs for people that are just learning to read.
I think that's a good time to segue to you, Manny, because I know you got some thoughts.
Yeah, and you did miss that Pokemon Stadium did the Game Boy integration.
Yes,
as
they
well.
did.
But whether this is when Pokemon came out, I don't recall being able to read when I was playing this.
I sure as hell couldn't read it.
I'm the youngest. I was born in 95, and this person's turning 30, so not to just age ourselves, but the reason why we're mentioning it is because Pokemania we were the prime target demographic for it. We were the kids that were being marketed to, and Jager and I actually met at design school. And one of the main reasons why I went to design school was kind of how enamored I was with Pokemon and how well it taught the principles of design. Generally, character design.
While we're on the subject of that stuff, like in regards to the presentation with the first Pokemon game, you do have to cut some slack since it is on essentially Stone Age hardware. And even some of the Poke Sprites that they have are a little rough, but you still have to admire the ingenuity. There are a lot of creative Pokemon for Gen 1.
Oh yeah, and there was a lot of stuff that got canned or got used down the line.
One of the things that I really appreciate is that I know Nintendo is all butthurt about the stuff that is been leaked from different times, like the Space World leak. But getting the source code and being able to see the development of Red and Blue has been really fun for me, because you can see how they adapted when they encountered design problems. Like, one of the most known things is that originally there was going to be a baby gym where Giovanni's gym is. There was going to be a baby little youngster Joey looking gym leader, but then Brock got redesigned and made to be the first gym leader. And so you get this mystery intrigue when you go to the first gym and you can't go in. But that was all just a happy accident.
Yeah.
And of course, something to mention that we are playing the American version. If you've seen the original Japanese version, the sprites were even rougher. If you can even
Right.
that.
That was something I was going to mention, that the first time I ever played... Okay, well, you didn't give me any Pokeballs. Okay. I haven't played this in just a hot minute, and I wanted to make sure... Because one of the things that's nice about comparing older Pokemon games is that when you go back and do whatever the equivalent of the Oaks parcel quest is, when you are given access to Pokeballs in the wider world, normally they'll give you at least some in the newer games. But in this game, there's a whole bunch of things that are quality of life changes that you don't notice until you go back to play this.
And there are also some balancing issues with the mechanics too. I think the most famous example would be due to a programming error. The Psychic type got an overpowered stat boost, so very few weaknesses to exploit. Like if you go up against Psychic types, you're going to have a rough time, and if you get a Psychic type in your scene, that's a pretty strong Pokemon for you to lean on, at least for this first game.
Yeah, even Kadabra, which most people would be stuck with if they didn't have any friends, is still
Or siblings.
Yeah,
or not or had to share one Game Boy.
Would still be considered, good by this game standards. And like you said, with very little counters to it, it was nigh unstoppable.
So this over here, not to interrupt, but this over here is an optional rival fight, which I learned about because of the guidebooks. Continue.
Now, the thing to keep in mind, though, with all these issues, it's kind of hard to recommend playing this game starting out. If you do want to get the Gen 1 experience, I think Fire Red and Leaf Green is the best place to start, because there was a lot of quality of life issues that was implemented into that game that made it easier.
It was essentially Pokemon Gen 1 remade with the graphics and innovations of Gen 3.
The mechanics of Gen 3.
And then there's also like the most recent remake of Gen 1, which is Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee for the Nintendo Switch, which is probably the version I'd recommend. Yeah. Just for how available it is.
Also, the Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee Switch is my personal Switch that Manny got me for my birthday one year.
But the thing about Gen 1 and 2, though, there was a lot of menu hopping. And it got really tedious very quickly.
Well, that's just kind of the natures of RPGs at the time too. You have to admit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly, and
that stuff doesn't get even marginally better until 5th generation. They begin to give you some of the quality of life updates. Oh, I should have healed. Oops.
Yeah, and when you go back to this, oh man, I forgot how tedious this is.
One simple quality of life thing that I'm noticing is you guys notice that you don't have the XP bar here. Mm-hmm. So, that's just a little thing that they introduced in Gen 2. That makes a lot of difference because, it gives you an idea of how far you are to leveling up.
Oh yeah, that was very handy.
And that's something else that I think works really well with the design of Pokemon. I remember before I got into, actually started playing RPGs, which is actually Autumn's fault because she made me play Pokemon.
I told him. I told him in college, this was around the time that 6th generation was the current generation. Yeah, I'm gonna lose this optional rival fight. That's fine.
Yeah, you weren't supposed to.
I wasn't. Yeah, I didn't grind. But
what I was gonna say was, the main thing that always pushed me off of RPGs was I just hated the concept of having to grind, just going through battles, fighting the same enemies over and over again, just to get the numbers game to go up. But with Pokemon, it started to click a little bit more when I started playing it, because it's sort of like you're a trainer training a boxer to fight. So you're making your Pokemon stronger, and as they get stronger, they learn new moves, and they can even evolve too. I think everyone knows the evolution cycle for the 3 starter Pokemon. So Squirtle turns into Blastoise, Charmander into Charizard eventually, and Bulbasaur into Venusaur.
So I'm just going to interrupt just to say, if we were to have tried to go this way earlier, this man right here, I've had my coffee now and I feel great. Sure, you could go through. Are you in a hurry? Time is money, get along then. He would have been passed out, and she was like, oh, Grandpa hasn't had his coffee. And of course, what's so fun for us American people is that in the original Japanese version, he's just passed out drunk or hungover. He just won't move. He hasn't woken up from his night caper of being a party animal.
You guys want to know what my favorite bits of Game Boy censorship and really Nintendo in general ever was?
What?
So there's a Game Boy Metal Gear Solid game, Metal Gear Ghost Babel, and as everyone knows, in Metal Gear, Snake always somehow gets his cigarettes onto the mission with him. But of course, Nintendo doesn't want cigarettes in any of their games.
Yeah.
So what do they call the cigarettes?
Are they candy cigarettes?
No, they call them foggers.
Oh!
Foggers.
That's clever.
Which I think was so hilarious that in my comic book, that's what I named the brand of cigarettes that one of my characters smokes.
That's pretty
clever,
funny.
honestly.
That's pretty funny. Yeah, there's certain things that our Nintendo America had to stick up their butt about, like specifically Christian religion, so crosses had to be removed, even though most Christians wouldn't be offended by it.
Violence in general
Say
was
that.
something else they tried to avoid too, and you can't really blame Nintendo for that too, because like when they entered the American industry with the NES, when they tried to market it to distributors, they were turned off by the fact that it was a video game console. This was after '83, so the video game market was in the toilet due to the crash of '83. So because of that, they had to market the NES as a toy.
Yep.
And because of that, that's where the perception of video games are strictly for children. And because Nintendo was so fixated on maintaining that, because they thought that's what they needed to do, when Sega entered the market with the Genesis and started pushing more mature games, that started leading to problems, and that's why eventually why we have the ESRB in place to sort of regulate that. And at the time, people were really concerned about having a rating system. They thought that would affect sales, but what they failed to realize was that when you put a rating on a video game, then that means you can do whatever the hell you want.
You have consumer choice.
Yeah, and I will say that whenever there's some sort of, huge phenomenon, there's always going to be that sort of quote-unquote counterculture. Like,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, before Pokemon, it was D&D. Now you tell somebody from back in the day, if you told somebody back then, oh yeah, like 30 years from now, D&D is going to be popular again, like, no way.
One of the
But after D&D, they moved over to Pokemon, and now that had controversy for whatever reason,
Well,
and
it was controversial because even back in the day, like let's be real, by the standards of American television at the time, Pokemon was a violent show.
Yeah, I mean, my mom even thought the Powerpuff Girls was a pretty violent show.
And I will say, the thing about Pokemon, you can't really think about it too hard because
Otherwise, it kind of breaks.
You are making.
Let's be real.
Yeah.
It is basically just the video game version of cockfighting.
Yeah, and PETA really hammered this point home hard.
In fifth generation.
Yeah, during 5th gen. So much so that Pokemon came down on them. The Nintendo company came down on them and told them to stop.
And let's be real, everyone compares Team Plasma and Gen 5 to PETA too.
I mean, they are PETA.
Even though they're full of crap.
Yeah, that's what's so funny is that just like the organization PETA, even if you are a genuinely good person and don't want animals to be abused, PETA has been known to be the most ass backwards of charities.
Remember, they kill most animals they save, so.
Yeah, it's... So, one of the things that we were talking about with the grind here is that I forgot how much running back and forth you have to do to Pokemon Centers in the very early of this game.
That's one of the features I really love in the modern Pokemon games. I really appreciate the XP share because, in the original game, up until, I think, Gen 6 where it became standard,
yeah,
you had to train your individual Pokemon, whereas you could still just play one Pokemon and still have all the others get a little XP. But there was still benefit to using your other Pokemon because they would get more XP if they were actually in the battle. But here, you had to essentially play your weaker Pokemon and then switch to your stronger Pokemon just so that weaker Pokemon will get a little bit of XP.
That's just what we did with Nidoran Female.
Yeah, and players who are veterans, of course, after beating Brock's gym, you could get a Magikarp very early in the game. And for somebody who may have never played Pokemon, this Pokemon's worthless. Why would I, use this? But if you knew what you were doing, as soon as you came out of the cave, you had a Gyarados. and which was a very strong start to this game.
Yeah.
That whole bit of this stupid koi fish Pokemon turning into a sea dragon, you realize they even worked that into One Piece recently.
I bet.
You know?
The Magikarp has gotten a lot of really cool character development, like including in the original Pokemon Snap, where they reference the a regular carp becoming a Chinese dragon by jumping a giant waterfall, and that's how you get Magikarp to evolve into Gyarados to take a picture of it.
That's just classic Japanese symbolism right
Yeah.
there. And like we're all fans of Pokemon, anime, and stuff like that. We can think of several anime where they do the whole koi fish into dragon thing, and that's something else. I mean, it's sort of a fun introduction to Japanese culture.
That's
too.
exactly what I was just gonna say.
It's a very common Japanese trope, like, oh, you gotta speak to the giant talking koi fish.
Here's another thing. We all grew up on the 4Kids dub of Pokemon, and we were one of the time before we hung out, we played on the Switch Nintendo 64 thing. We played the Pokemon Puzzle League, and they go so hard. The 4Kids team did so much additional voice work for that game. It's phenomenal.
I'll say what you will about 4Kids, but I never thought the Pokemon dub they did was that bad. I always thought that was an appropriate project for them because it is more geared towards kids. And yes, they did do some stupid things like trying to Americanize it.
Their censorship was silly. It wasn't offensive.
I mean, the one example of like really bad 4Kids censorship, you could really just point to One Piece. That's a very good example of why.
Even in regards to the One Piece version, the 4Kids dub of One Piece, like that's actually how I was introduced to One Piece, and I remember watching that and thinking it was weird that the Marines had paintball guns. I thought it was weird that
the candy,
it was
the lollipop instead of the cigarettes.
That. But the thing was, it still told the story, and even when they tried to change it, like with Arlong locking up Nami's mother figure instead of killing her, like even as a kid, I knew what they were doing. Arlong freaking killed Nami's mother. So the story still gets through, and that's just a testament to how good One Piece is. Even a crappy dub can't ruin it.
Honestly, that was kind of the 4Kids dub is kind of what turned me off from One Piece. But then get to the fact that it's now like 1,000 chapters, I'm like, I'm not doing this.
Well, One Piece is a whole nother spiel for another story.
It is a different time.
You guys are not One Piece fan. I'm probably gonna have my friend Zoe on the stream to talk about a One Piece game at some point.
Yeah.
But the point was, like, Pokemon was just a good introduction to a lot of Japanese culture.
I will say that's what I mean about the censorship being silly. The jelly donut is like the most classic example of it, and that to me, because when I was watching 4Kids, the lineup included Sonic X, and Sonic X had a lot of the similar silly censorship of, and by censorship, I literally mean changing the signs from like, calligraphy of Japanese kanji and such to English whatever the hell.
Yeah,
oftentimes they didn't even put anything on the signs. I remember there was
they left
one
them blank.
clip where you have Chris holding up a sign and there's just nothing on it, and you're just wondering what the heck you're doing.
They had to censor a lot of stuff in the Sonic X.
Surprisingly, and I'm glad that they did to some degree, because I do not like the idea of Sonic swearing like a bastard in front of a child. But that is, again, another spiel.
A different time.
We are getting such off topic. We're supposed to be talking about freaking Pokemon.
Let's go ahead and go with another question. So, did you see the anime first, or did you play a game first?
God, I honestly can't remember if I played the game first or watched the anime. This came out when I was just starting to be.
Yeah, you guys were both very, very young at this early time.
It was probably the anime that I saw first.
I know I saw the anime first, and I didn't have a Game Boy or a Game Boy Color. I got a Game Boy Advance for my 10th birthday, like I previously mentioned, and I later went and played Red and Blue on a computer. And what's so fun is that, like, when you go back and you play these games, you can see how the design of both the Pokemon, both like the world itself. Like in early Simpsons, there used to be some weird wonky people. Now there's rules for how Simpson characters are designed. Just like how when they went and did Fire Red and Leaf Green, they standardized how many fingers Pokemon had because they were such a, flying by the seat of their pants for so long that, like, they just ended up doing what most animators and character designers do, and they, like, shortened the fingers down from, like, 4 to 3. But they did have to give Mr. Mime a canonical thumb because parents of the Japanese persuasion apparently didn't want children to be taught about the Yakuza cutting fingers off.
But, and I would blame, and I think that's why Pokemon took over Digimon as far as popularity went, because at least Pokemon had some pretty strict, or not, I wouldn't say strict, but they had like clear guidelines, clear rules on how things worked. Whereas with Digimon, they kind of played a little fast and loose with it. I'm sure they made some more, over the years they made it more consistent, but I wouldn't know. I kind of stopped watching Digimon.
I actually have a more concise understanding of what you're talking about because it was for my marketing class. The reason Digimon fell off the way it did was because it just sort of fell into a bit of brand inconsistency.
Mm-hmm.
For the first 2 seasons of Digimon, it was pretty consistent. You had Ty and his gang, and they were in the 2nd season, but they were sort of acting as mentors to a new group of people. But after that, you had Digitamers, which felt like its own thing. It was almost a completely different show.
Yeah, and
didn't
that bring the Digimon into the real world? Is that the one I'm thinking of?
Yeah, that's Digitamers. And
It's
then,
the red Digi. It's the red Agumon.
And then you had, like, after that, Digimon Frontiers, and it just kept changing. It had the same effect that Power Rangers did, because a lot of people don't even realize that Power Rangers went on past Mighty Morphin, and the reason for that is they kept changing out the characters every season, and a lot of people just found it hard to care because they didn't have anything to latch onto. Whereas Pokemon, one of the big driving forces for it, because the video games come out and people play them, but what's likely to keep a kid's attention is going to be the anime, the TV show, and that stayed such a consistent continuity for so long. I mean, it wasn't.
It literally just changed just now, and this, like we said, the game, the earliest date is 1995.
Yeah, and that's the thing. You have to keep things simple. And with Digimon, when you start bringing Digimon into the real world, I'm like, I thought these are digital monsters. It's like, it's in the name. So, why does it exist in the real world? They're kind of ignoring their own rules, so to speak. At least Pokemon kept it consistent.
And again, it's a different continuity, so
You don't have the same characters to be like, oh, I know Ty.
So people who watch the original series, they're gonna wonder where the other characters are. And then new people are gonna wonder, oh, well, there were 2 seasons before this, so why
would I start at this 3rd thing?
And yeah, Pokemon was just consistent, and that's also why I feel like Yu-Gi-Oh! Didn't stay as popular as Pokemon did, because, same thing. After the first series, people just sort of kept going off and on.
There was no consistency with the original Yu-Gi-Oh! And if you want, and the thing about Yu-Gi-Oh! Is that they did keep changing the rules in Yu-Gi-Oh!
Yeah.
So.
What I recently-ish, not within maybe last year, I watched season 0, and it's great. I loved it. It was so great. I loved how evil Yami is.
Yeah, and once again, we're getting off topic there. But
yeah, so
Yu-Gi-Oh! Is important when you're discussing Pokemon, because that's really where the Pokemon craze ended. And, that's sort of why I fell off of Pokemon, because, when they got to Johto, with the first 2 seasons of Pokemon, it was typically consistent with its pacing. It was usually maybe 1 or 2 episodes before they got to a gym leader. But then Johto came out, and there was just so much empty space between the gym leaders. that it just kind of felt like nothing was happening. It wasn't growing up with its audience.
Yeah, after the third movie, I would say it started falling off.
Which is why when Yu-Gi-Oh came out, which was darker, sharper, a bit more sinister looking.
Yeah, and
that just got people's attention. So
Yeah.
people who grew up on Pokemon.
And it kind of took away from like the Pokemon TCG because at least like, oh, here's a card game. This anime is based off of a card game.
Okay, there is an important question. And I want you guys to answer this question honestly.
Okay.
Do you guys know the official rules of the Pokemon trading card game?
I
No.
do. Not when I first asked for those cards though. I don't think when the cards came out, I don't think any kid knew how to play Pokemon.
What I honestly always
TCG
asked
itself.
was like nobody got the cards to play them. It was like currency on the playground.
Exactly.
Loud.
No one knew how to play the Pokemon game, but with Yu-Gi-Oh, if you watch the anime, you had some sort of idea.
Except when the anime lied to you.
But even then, the anime lied to you.
What I was going to bring up just to say about 4Kids is that Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh ended up being airing around the same time on Kids WB, which was on American broadcast television. I did not have cable growing up, so most of the anime experiences that I have is from the Kids WB, the Fox Kids, and whatever the CW would sometimes air.
Well, the CW was eventually what WB turned into.
Right, but the different blocks of the broadcast stuff.
But I kind of wish when the TCG came out that they put more emphasis on showing kids on how it worked because it is a simple game and it's huge now. But
isn't that part of why they put out the video game?
Exactly.
Pokemon trading card game?
Yes, and it is actually very good. And apparently, there's a lost or a not localized second one.
And yeah, that's crazy to think. Pokemon was so freaking popular that they didn't just release the card game; they made a freaking video game of it too.
Yeah, and this was in the original TCG was released by Wizards of the Coast, but the fact that they couldn't get people to latch onto it early, or continue playing it during Pokemania. I feel like it was a huge failure because these are the Magic people.
Well, one of the things that I will say is that we all returned to Pokemon eventually. Obviously, we talked about our early memories with these games, but I have a solid collection of the original games. Some of them are my games that are my original cards from when they came out. My original copy of Emerald, my original Fire Red and Leaf Green. I eventually bought a copy of Blue that came with its box and manual, and a copy of Yellow that came with its box and manual.
Yeah, for me, I was huge into Pokemon when Gen 1 and Gen 2 were making the rounds, but when Yu-Gi-Oh came out, that's around the time when Gen 3 hit the scene too, and I just was more interested in Yu-Gi-Oh! I just completely lost interest in Pokemon.
Oh yeah.
And then when I entered 6th grade and middle school, it was essentially social suicide to have any enjoyment of Pokemon or Yu-Gi-Oh! If you flashed any of that stuff, you would get your ass kicked immediately.
Honestly, I think the resurgence started coming after Gen 5. I got back into it in Gen 5. It was still not necessarily socially acceptable to play Pokemon during that time, but that's when I really got back into it and realized the amount of nuance that I never knew that Pokemon had in the competitive scene.
Gen 5 was just big, but then Gen 6 came out, which I think was an anniversary year for the series.
Mm-hmm. They went really hard, and that's when we were hanging out in college, and I was playing Pokemon, as my comfort video game because I really like Pokemon.
I will admit though, X and Y was a bit of a blur for me.
I just wanted to bring attention while this little man is on screen. Look how funny Sandshrew looks in this sprite. He's so cute. He looks all wrinkly. He doesn't look like he has plates. He looks like he has a wrinkle.
But yeah, X and Y was kind of a blur for me, but that's when I feel like when competitive Pokemon really became a thing. Because even my university had held some Pokemon tournaments.
Like officially sanctioned stuff for like being qualified?
I don't think they were officially sanctioned, but it was like a university event.
Well, we had a bunch of we went to a school in South Carolina, and we had a whole like section of our student union building that people just were like the Magic the Gathering people and the Pokemon people. Also the Smash Bros people.
Yeah, and unfortunately the Smash Bros people took over everything.
They
We
did.
don't talk about Smash
We
Bros.
don't
people.
talk about them.
But
My university had that too. I don't talk about that.
But yeah, that was my experience with Pokemon. After I started hanging out with Autumn, she got me to get Gen 6 to try. And I enjoyed it, but I accidentally deleted everything I had done somehow. But I eventually gave the first generation to try. Then I played the second generation, then I played the third generation. I basically spent a whole year playing all the Pokemon games again, and with every game I played, they just got better and better and better. By the time I got to Gen 6, that's when Gen 7 came out.
Yep.
That was the first time in here. I was excited for a Pokemon game.
And you want to know why? And something to know. You want to know why these Pokemon games got better after fourth gen? The advent of internet connection.
Yeah.
Well, even just from a design standpoint, they were getting better and better.
Like
They were getting a designs, but I guess what you're saying, both saying is correct. What you're saying is the design got better with each game, and then by the time the technology caught up, because we were talking about how the Game Boy Advance had basically a bundle with Fire Red and Leaf Green, the wireless adapter, and the Pokemon team developing the wireless adapter for the Game Boy Advance basically led directly to the development of the technology for the DS.
Hold that thought for 1 second. We need to ask a very important question, and this is one that was big back when this first came out.
Mm-hmm.
Is the way Brock is drawn in the anime racist?
No.
I thought it was so stupid when I heard that.
It was so stupid that he literally got to come back when I was watching the anime for a second time, because I also fell off after the Indigo League, which is what they call the first season of Pokemon.
And let's be real, Brock is Ash's best bro because he stuck by him.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, for sure.
Everyone else.
But something to know, just to get back to what I was going to refer to.
Yes.
After fifth gen, it introduced like an internet connection. For fifth gen, like internet connection, so you could like play with other people all over the internet. But then when Pokemon hit the 3DS era, you got the the pass system, and with the pass system was great because it encouraged you to go out and just bring your
3DS in your book bag or your purse or
exactly
whatever.
DS with you, and you got rewards for like play coins and stuff like that. I'm to this day still using play coins for my SMT4 playthrough from what I collected back in the day. But that allows you it really encouraged people to bring their DS with them and
connect with other players.
Yeah, that's how I was playing Monster Hunter in my university.
This is something else I want to point out here. Like, your choice of starter actually is pretty important because depending on who you pick, you're going to have either a really easy time or a very hard time, depending on who you pick. Because Autumn here picked Squirtle, and rock types are weak against water types. So she was just able to curb stomp Brock.
Yeah, if you started.
And I did this just so that we could get through this first gym leader in under an hour.
Yeah, and if you chose Pikachu or Charmander, and I got this from the strategy guide I had, it was your only option was go get a Mankey, teach it locate.
You're not your only option. I picked the other option, which is a Metapod that you can get to a Butterfree to learn Confusion.
Oh yeah, that'll take him out too. And that's another thing that's really brilliant about the structure and design of Pokemon. The fact that your main goal is to take out the gym leaders. There's other stuff you do throughout the course of the game that's story related, of course. But by having individual gym leaders and having them each specialize in a specific type of Pokemon, that encourages you to go out and explore, look for other Pokemon and experiment with the different types. Because you can only have 6 Pokemon on your team, so it's basically you trying to figure out what you need on your team in order to cover as much of your weaknesses as possible. And again, it's playing in to just how approachable this system is.
One of the things I wanted to mention before I forgot is that the Pokemon first generation was kind of designed. You kind of like, why is this kid allowed to go on a big world-spanning adventure? He's basically going the length of how far he can ride on his bike in any direction. In Generation 2, it's the how far can a kid in Japan go if they have access to a train. And, American culture, we don't necessarily let our kids ride trains by themselves to go have little adventures. But the scale works if you think about it from a design perspective.
I never did think about that. It's less of like a big regional tournament and just more like a local boxing scene.
It is, and not only that, you get to see like the little habitats and different design of towns. I really like Johto games, both the Game Boy Color games and the DS. The DS game is my favorite game of all time. My mom has bought me many Poke Walkers. She's bought me like maybe 2 replacements.
Hey, it's one of the best pedometers made.
It is. It was literally one of the best pedometers made, and one of the things that
really, if you put Pokemon in anything, especially when we were growing up, you were guaranteed to make at least.
Well, what I was going to mention is that by the time that 4th generation and the pedometer was happening, that was like doing some callbacks to the Pocket Pikachu, and also that was like laying the groundwork for eventually Pokemon Go, one of the biggest things in the whole world. And like, I was gonna mention this because in my brain as a child, when I played a Pokemon game, if I rode in the backseat of a car like to a trip to the mountains or a trip to the beach, if I caught a Pokemon that was like water themed or mountain themed, like rocks or a seashell, I'd be so freaking psyched. I'd be like, oh yeah, I'm gonna draw this Pokemon in my sketchbook, and I'm just gonna nerd out and be like a complete little Pokemon kid.
Yeah, you can tell Autumn really loves these games, which is why I wanted to have her on the stream for this.
Yeah, and she still plays Pokemon Go to this day. I guess it invokes that sort of nostalgia.
It does.
Even more so because now, depending on where you are, you find different type of Pokemon.
It's not just that, it also integrates into the current games that, is nice.
Here's an interesting question. If you guys were to design Pokemon, what would you make? If I were to make a Pokemon, I would make a set of 3, and there would basically be fighting types themed after the 3 styles of Boxen, Swarmer, Outfighter, and Slugger.
That's actually pretty smart.
What would you make, Manny?
I'm thinking about it.
I guess I'll say something. So one of the things that I think is really cool about Pokemon is when they take like something that is unexpected, because if the time we're recording this is right before the second half of Scarlet and Violet's DLC drops, and the Apple Pokemon from Generation 8, I used to think that was stupid. But then I just like really loved the animation of watching the Apple Core like burst out for the Flappy Dragon, and then the big dumb dragon that's like slow is funny. And Diplin was introduced in the Teal Mask DLC, so I don't know. I just love Pokemon designs. They're so funny to me.
Honestly, it's kind of hard to say what I would do because whatever that could be done, they've pretty much done it at this point. So coming up with something like completely new that's within the realm of what could be believable is kind of tough.
One of the things I was going to mention when we were talking about Digimon is that Pokemon has a much more cohesive design theory. Digimon can be so many things.
And a lot of Digimon designs, in my experience, tend to be like super overdone.
And more mature. They're more mature. They're
terrifying.
Like with guns. And they don't always do the 4Kids Yu-Gi-Oh censor for the Digimon guns. Like, I'm not knocking it. I'm just pointing out that if parents
are put them up.
Yeah, just because Digimon, in a weird way, is a nice mirror to Pokemon, because you get to see what it would be like if they decided to move on from Ash way earlier in the series.
You realize that the dub company that handled Digimon, that was actually Saban, right? The guys who did, Power Rangers?
Sounds about right.
Which is funny because Power Rangers is actually very similar in that regard. It's basically taken the footage from a show called Super Sentai and then just for the unmorphed scenes, just shooting.
New
That
stuff.
was another one that they had to rewrite too. So.
Yeah, and again, that sort of fell off for the same way Digimon is. Digimon's still around, Power Rangers still around, but it just wasn't as consistent as Pokemon was.
And now Pokemon is like one of the biggest franchise that, like, if you count like all the money they make from the merchandising, the movie, Detective Pikachu. Did I go see that with you?
No.
I saw that with you.
You saw that with me.
Yeah, you saw the Detective Pikachu.
Like, honestly, I think of what everything Nintendo has done, that Pokemon is probably Nintendo's most marketable and profitable franchise.
Oh yeah,
because
Disney has Mickey Mouse itself has nothing on Pokemon.
Yeah,
Of
the
course-
rats are fighting.
Of course, the mouse now owns like a bunch of other properties under it, so like combined,
Yeah.
I'm sure it will beat out Pokemon
Yeah.
in profit. But still,
Yeah, the Disney mouse bought Star Wars and Marvel. They, even though they've got too much cultural saturation to like, because people don't appreciate a new Star Wars whatever like they used to appreciate when a new Star Wars came out.
they do appreciate it.
They appreciate it, but
just
not in
that-
the same way that there was when there was a Star Wars drought.
I don't appreciate mainline.
And while we're on the subject there, we are getting off topic again. That's just what happens when we're
but
talking
it's
about
yeah, it is
We're
very
very good
profitable.
friends if you can't tell.
It is very profitable. There's a Pokemon thing for everyone.
Please. I need a slurp
There's
of
a
water.
Pokemon thing for everyone. I think, but what I do enjoy about Pokemon that they've been doing in recent media, they're making it seem more lived in.
Yeah, they are definitely do that, especially now that the games are going open world too.
Yeah, like if you saw Detective Pikachu, for example, you just see Pokemon just walking around in the regular world. I'm like, yes, this.
I was honestly more interested to see that than following that kid in the movie who was the very definition of a wet blanket.
And
He ruined that whole movie.
I didn't think Detective Pikachu was a bad movie. If anything, it
Oh,
was
it
decent.
wasn't. It wasn't a bad movie at all. I just didn't think it was that.
But
good.
I did really appreciate the world building. Like, oh yeah, these are Pokemon. They live in the world and they're part of the world. Although, the whole you can't Pokemon battle in here in city, it was kind of weird, but whatever.
Okay, so here's a good question. The Pokemon anime, with how freaking popular it is, it's had so many movies based on it.
Yeah.
What is the best Pokemon movie? You guys know what mine is, which is the second one, Pokemon the movie 2000, or The Power of One if you live in Japan. What do you
I
guys
personally really like the Entei movie. I think the third Pokemon movie is the one I've rewatched the most.
think? They just call that one Pokemon the movie 3,
Yeah,
but
the third one.
the title is Spell the Unknown.
Yeah.
So it's more of an unknown movie.
It's an
than
unknown
it's an
Entei movie. I actually have one of those weird collections that has the Jirachi movie, the Latios and Latias movie, and I think one else, maybe the Lucario movie, something like that weird 3rd to 4th gen type area. But like I have a DVD copy of Pokemon the third movie, and you want to know what's so funny? I'm
Well,
so
we need-
much of a Pokemon fan. I watched it with the director's commentary on.
Yeah, and in my opinion, I think the second movie was probably the best one. Nostalgia Critic really tore apart the first one.
Well, the first one's not very good.
He didn't have the context behind it, but the first movie kind of like flipped the whole concept of Pokemon on its head in a bad way.
It was just a stupid message. Like the whole thing was fighting is bad.
Yeah, and
But
that's what I'm
it's
saying. If you
hypocritical
think
to
about
do
it,
that because the whole let's be real. Pokemon is founded on fighting.
yeah, and that's what I mean. If you think about it too hard,
It falls apart.
It falls apart, and that's what the movie did.
And that's one thing that I really want to make clear to especially parents. There is a difference between fighting and violence. Two dudes in a boxing match, testing their skills, testing their strength, with respect for each other, that is fighting. Two dudes fighting on the side of the street because one of them was having a really bad day and this poor guy just happened to bump into him and then he lost his crap too and they just start beating the crap out of each other. That is violence. There is a difference between fighting and violence. Pokemon is fighting, it is not violence.
I also do like the idea that there are Pokemon in the world that are openly hostile.
Oh yeah.
Because like any wild animal, like you don't just go over to the
Let's
walk up
let's
to a
briefly
lion.
touch on
Hey.
Legends Arceus before we wrap up for the day. because the Legends Arceus is a nice, the Legends game, hopefully Legends plural because I want another one. If you play that, the Pokemon are hostile to you if they're going to be hostile. Like, they also run away from you if they're scared of you. It's a very more real lived-in feeling, and I gotta say, when Pokemon Legends Arceus came out, I thought that should have been the only Pokemon game released that year. They should have gave it more time to breathe, but that's just me.
I thought it was repetitive as hell. I thought they should have scrapped that and just focused on Gen 8 or Gen 9 because the biggest problem people had with that was all the technical issues. Maybe if you had not done this super repetitive open world game, instead put that extra work into polishing this inventive approach to doing an open world Pokemon game, maybe you wouldn't have had that issue.
I disagree. Because I feel like Legends Arceus created a blueprint of what Pokemon games should be going forward.
There's two different types of Pokemon. There's the catching and the battling. If you're a battling type person, you don't appreciate the Legends Arceus strong versus agile style.
It created the groundwork for like an open world Pokemon game.
Yeah.
Of course, they had like a timeline that they were trying to meet, and the potential for Gen 8 is there.
You mean Gen 10, the one that's coming out next year?
The one we're on now. 9. Okay. There was some real potential there. I saw the potential, but it just needed more time.
Mm-hmm.
There's just no way around it. It needed that time.
What I will say about the state of Pokemon right now is that the Pokemon Company needs to give each release more breathing room, whether it's a spin-off release, because there was a director's cut of Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Red Rescue Team for the Switch, and apparently it didn't perform very well. But the Red Rescue Team was one of my favorite Game Boy Advance games, and that was the other game besides Pokemon Crystal that I was replaying on original hardware this year.
Alright, so we're at an hour now, so why don't you go ahead and exit out the emulator there, Autumn, and then we'll just give some final thoughts on Gen 1. So
okay.
don't exit that out, because that's how we end the stream.
Obviously, yes.
Okay, so like I've done reviews on all the Pokemon games, so like I have, and in order too, so I have a pretty clear understanding of it from a mechanical standpoint, and my thoughts on the first Pokemon game is that like it laid the foundation, but it's just aged to the point where there's really no point in playing it anymore. Like I would personally recommend either, as you guys said, Fire Red or Leaf Green, or again, Let's Go Eevee, or really just any recent Pokemon game, because let's face it, they don't really connect in terms of story. So
no, like Pokemon's designed that you could just pick it up and go,
which is good for
like
the
Final
series.
Fantasy or an SMT. But honestly, believe it or not, I think the spin-off games are excellent.
There's so many different Pokemon spin-off games. There's many spin-off series. Pokemon Ranger is one that's been dormant for a while.
Yeah, but we're not talking about
We're not talking about that. We're talking
about the first vanilla Pokemon game.
The first vanilla Pokemon.
Do you guys think it's still worth playing today?
If you like really want to see what it was like, if you're just completely new, I don't think you should start with that one.
I feel like if you are looking for a certain experience, Pokemon Red and Blue and Yellow are there for a reason. You should go back and replay them if you're interested to see the roots of the series. Just like I think it's important to go back and play like maybe a wonky-ass NES title for a series that's still ongoing.
Yeah, but as far as starting points, I think the best ones would be Gen 5. Or the remakes of, Red and Green.
Like, if I were to recommend one just right out of the box, I would probably recommend Gen 6 personally, because that was my favorite up until Sword and Shield came out.
And you could just jump into any of them, but I recommend Gen 5. That's my favorite. But they also made it so that it's kind of like, so it could be like a first-time experience.
Yeah, they did some work on the back end to make sure that it was like a very similar to Red and Blue.
Yeah, so they're not like hitting you with all these Pokemon. They keep it to its own decks. They try to give you a feel for for the first of like playing it for the first time. They try to teach you this type. They
They do very similar things like that the first games does.
Yeah, they try to fix the things that the first game otherwise never really properly teaches you.
I would agree. And what about you, Autumn? What do you think, like, and outside of just the Gen 1 games too, what do you think would be the best starting point?
I think one of the best starting places, if you have a Switch, you have plenty of options. If you want to play like a capture Pokemon game, Legends Arceus, if you want to play a battle game, pick Pokemon Sword or Shield. I guess also, pick up pick up Scarlet and Violet. Scarlet and Violet are the current Pokemon, and the second part of the DLC is going to be releasing here in a couple of days. So, I tried the Union Circle on that, so if you want to actually play the most easily accessible without having to go to a game store and try to find either a reproduction cartridge or an actual physical thing, you can play the most current Pokemon, and it's a very Pokemon-feeling Pokemon to me.
That sounds about right. Well, anyway, guys, thanks for joining me today.
Yes, thank you so much for having us.
Was it fun?
It was great.
Sure.
I had a lot of fun.
It was a lot of fun, and I hope that reflects in the views we get too.
I hope it reflects in how excited I was to talk about Pokemon.
So anyway, Mandy and Autumn won't be able to join me for every video. This isn't going to be the last time I have them on, though. We will be covering other Pokemon games in the future. But if you want to see more of me just talking about games, I do these videos every week, usually around 8 o'clock. I'm actually doing another one tonight at 8 o'clock. I'm playing Diddy Kong Racing. But if you would like to see more, please like and subscribe to keep up with it. After I do the live stream, I also post it to YouTube as just a regular video. So if that's something you're interested in, please like and subscribe.
Yes.
Anyway, you guys have a good night, and we'll see you next time.
Yep.
Excuse me, Autumn, because now I have to
the star of the show.
awkwardly turn the video off.
Yes.
So that